Now, I was about to reply to Petey Boy, you know, make a part 2, as I usually don't do. But then he got sent a letter by the Holy Empire of Psychologists that tells him to either do a education course in proper Twitter etiquette or lose his practicing license for the crime of retweeting the Conservative Party leader and voicing his opinion against cloth muzzles and prick mandates. And that puts me in the awkward position of not only having to fight my inner laziness, which is hard, but also my utter disdain for power-hungry, methane-producing bovine posteriors if ever I want to finish this video. And that is quite a challenge because I need 2 people nagging me on Discord repeatedly just to get over my laziness hurdle alone. How on earth are these poor devils who are already texting me uninterruptedly just for my laziness supposed to counter-interact this? This sort of power move not only is stupid, facepalm-inducing and dangerous, but it also further reinforces my prejudice that shrinks are a bunch of mentally prepubescent junk food sniffers without a shred of an idea of what the hell they're actually doing. Actually, I take that back. No, they know exactly what they're doing. They're telling their fellow junk food sniffer to get back in line and stick to the pre-packaged, over-the-counter woo-woo that they are already selling, rather than the woo-woo that he just made up by himself. Because even in the area of woo-woo, apparently you have to go corporate because individually sold woo-woo just doesn't do it for them. I mean, it's not like he got dinged for abusing his own patients. Partially because he has no patience, which makes that move even more ridiculous, but mostly because retweeting the Conservative Party leader of Canada is not patient abuse. Not unless the Empire of Psychologists consider his tweets their personal therapy, that is. Which, at this point, I'd not even be surprised if they did, because crazy works in mysterious ways, clearly. I am just waiting for the day on which we will see people getting kicked out of the mighty mini-golf club for saying that pineapple does not belong on pizza. I'm sorry. I did not want to start the video this way. I did not want to start with a rant, but can you really expect me to start with your average middle-of-the-barrel kind of stupid? If it is outperformed by stupid that is so deep that you have to go through the barrel bottom to even reach it? No? Me neither. Alright, I'll quickly go disinfect my eyes and ears and every other kind of orifices that have gotten in touch with this kind of nonsense, and let's get back to bearable stupid. Please, cue the intro.
When they are children, boys are hectored for their toy preferences, which often include toy weapons such as guns.
Starting off fancy already, are we? To hector is a word that references the Greek figure Hector, who killed Achilles in the Iliad, and it originally meant to restrain or to hold someone, to manhandle, if you prefer. But nowadays, to hector often has a more negative connotation and is more akin to bullying or harassing people into something. In this context, we're talking about kids being harassed into their toy preferences. And yes, that is a very, very old and very common problem. For example, the toy market is an incredibly pushy entity that tries to not only compete for eyes to sell more, but it also is used as a tool to pass on certain culturally favored ideals. Sort of like in the Middle Ages, a girl who would be destined to become a nun would, for example, be given a nun doll to play with in order to prepare her for it. Nowadays, of course, we have glittery ponies, very likely with mildly toxic substances, produced in a Uyghur camp in China. And we have Super Mr. Hyper Awesome Superhero, who is borderline anorexic and whose purpose it is to say the same sentence over and over and over again, driving anyone with ears completely crazy. And then we have pink rifles, we have boy bras, we have toys in every possible and impossible shape and color, and in every possible and impossible outfit, just to make sure no kid remains unbribed and no parents' wallet spared. And that is probably not even scratching the surface of the problem. For example, due to the way many schools in North America seem to operate, there is a huge amount of money leached off of parents via the learning institutions themselves, of all places. Because they get kickbacks for encouraging people to buy cheap garbage to not feel like their kids are being left out. And I'm totally not talking of experience, no, not whatsoever. There are billions of dollars flowing around this way, only to convince children what is and isn't good to play with, and it's done so through deceptive marketing and aggressive advertising tactics. And that, of course, doesn't even begin to cover family, environmental, societal, and other factors that can cause children to pick one toy over another. For example, if the government says you may not own a particular kind of game, then you may not own a particular kind of game. And if your mommy really hates the pew-pews, video game or otherwise, you do not get a pew-pew. And she too, of course, is influenced by her surrounding, because chances are that she really doesn't like the pew-pews because some media outlet or some people around her told her that the pew-pews are really bad for her kid, for some reason or another. Now, I suspect that Peterson alludes to a particular type of toy bullying, but he doesn't really go into details. And so I won't either, because I would just start blindly hypothesizing around, which is not the point of this video. However, I would like to point out that the problem with this issue is that there is no special interest group who doesn't have an ambition of sorts to push its own preferences on kids. And therefore, while we can acknowledge that it happens, we can't simply point the finger and say, they did it, or these other people did it, or they there did it, because there are just way too many they who join in. In fact, it would be much quicker and much easier to point out which they do not participate. And no matter how many particular parties we try to stop from using these tactics, we will never get to them all, and thus we run risk to be considered biased, one way or another. It is pretty much like playing whack-a-mole with an army of moles on steroids. All we can realistically do is be responsible parents and keep our kids away from stupid whenever we can, while teaching them how to keep themselves away from stupid whenever they can, and we can't be there to do it for them. Sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and say, no kiddo, you won't get a $500 doll whose head will pop up in 5 minutes, no matter how glittery and shiny her nylon back dress is. And no, you're not gonna put harmful chemicals on your little baby head either, just because some advertisement somewhere told you that you will have the bestest rainbow colors and that you will totally look like this super cool, badly produced 2D comic pony that you saw on TV once. Yes, dear. Call Baby Bean all you like.
And their more boisterous playing style, as boys require active, rough and tumble play, even more than girls, for whom it is also a necessity.
Well, rough and tumble play certainly is a necessity for boys and girls, that much is for sure. However, the idea that boys need to be more rough and tumble than girls is, questionable. I tried to look up actual statistics of boys versus girls playing, and I found an interesting article from 2016 entitled Gender Difference in Rough and Tumble Play Behaviors by S. Julie Harbin. While this study only had a very small sample size of 10 one-hour observation periods in kindergarten classes, meaning it's obviously not la crème de la crème of science, it still gives us a bit of a rough idea of what we're actually dealing with. And within the article, Harbin determines that solo rough and tumble play is much more common in boys, but girls tend to be involved in much more team rough and tumble play. In short, it would seem that boys prefer to duke it out one-on-one, while girls really like to team up, or gang up, I guess. And due to the same study, even if boys seem to take part in it more aggressively, rough and tumble play is exceedingly common for both boys and girls. As said, this is a very small study, and it is very restricted in sample size and other things. And of course, we need to account for culture as well, since depending on where you live, kids could get more or less restrained and to different levels. For example, are the boys in these settings generally more allowed to seek out aggressive behaviors than their girl peers? Or maybe the other way around? Or perhaps was this study otherwise skewed? We do not know. We cannot know. And I have personally seen how much difference a little change here or there can actually make. You see, Canada, or at least the part of Canada where I'm living in, seems to really like safety, at least outside of the skating rink. All playgrounds that I've ever seen are super safe, with ropes and nets and not too high and well-rounded corners and everything made of plastic and whatnot. And you will catch a lot of parents fussing over their kids' safety even then. Whereas if you were to go to my old hometown, you would see preschoolers climbing on the roof of a 2-story tall playhouse made of solid wood that tends to splinter occasionally. And the parents are not necessarily happy about the fact that their kids climb all the way up there, but they're still dandy enough about it to just let them do. And the difference shows, because at the start of our vacation, my own kid, who was used to Canada-style hyper-safety, of course, was utterly terrified of the slides over there, because they were, of course, bigger than the palm of my hand. And at the end of our trip, after weeks of relentless exposure to the local play customs, she went down the giant 2-story metal slide head first, with a professional kiddo lift off at the end of it, and either getting plucked out of the air by mommy or daddy, if we were fast enough, or landing belly first in the mat with half the playground on her shirt and a wide grin on her face, ready to rush off to go again. She then obviously came back from her vacation, and the first thing she did was infecting her playmates with relentless fun-having and nearly giving the poor Canada safety standards trained mother of said kids a bloody heart attack. I'm so proud of you, kiddo. Either way, to get back to the study, even though there are things to consider, it seems, at least on a general basis, to be rather clear-cut. Kids who are allowed to rough and tumble play will do so, and kids who are not allowed won't. So yes, I agree that boys shouldn't be hectored away from rough and tumble play and should get enough time to roughen about. In fact, that should happen far more, as far as I'm concerned. But I disagree that they need it more than girls. Or, to phrase it differently, that girls need it less compared to boys. Because boisterous play is good for brain and body development regardless of whether you're a boy or a girl. That aside, if as a girl you're allowed to rough and tumble about and enjoy it, you're far more likely to let your sons and daughters rough and tumble about. Whereas you might be far more inclined to rein them in if you as a kid got restrained. After all, if one sex is in distress or restrained, that has an impact on the other one. Right, Dr. Petey? And I'm not so much pointing that out because I think Peterson would disagree with me, if pressed, because I suspect that he probably doesn't. I am pointing it out because I know that an awful lot of his followers agree with Peterson's idea of boys roughhousing about, but then turn around and utterly ignore his mentions of girls needing to roughen about.
When in grade school, boys are admonished, shamed, and controlled in a very similar manner by those who think that play is unnecessary, particularly if it's competitive, and who value a docile, harmless obedience above all. Shades of Dolores Umbridge.
Slight correction there, Dr. Peterson. When in grade school, all children are taught to be obedient and quiet. There is a very good book by John Taylor Gatto called Dumbing Us Down. It goes in great lengths through the many problems of public schooling. One of the things he points out is the segmented one subject per hour system. You have to be super into subject X. Then the bell rings, and you're supposed to instantly discard all of your thoughts concerning subject X, because now it is suddenly irrelevant. Instead, you now have to be super invested into subject Y, all of a sudden. Until the next bell, of course, because then you will have to switch again. That is a very human brain unfriendly way of teaching. Some have even proposed that it encourages concentration troubles in children and can have an impact on their attention span once they're older. However, I have not seen any proper data on it, so I can't really affirm or deny that. What is true, however, is that we have a top-down, standardized system that has metrics of what data in what period is supposed to be injected into the kids' brains with one or maybe two overseeing teachers for a huge horde of kids. And they have to do what they can to adapt this one-size-fits-all curriculum to a vast range of different learner types and characters, which, depending on the teacher, is somewhere between challenging and outright impossible. And that pretty much guarantees that some kids will just be left behind, while others will be bored out of their mind. One could say, okay, you know what? parents could pick up the slack once the children are at home. But that again would imply a certain amount of presence of the parents in the house, which, as we established in part 1, is rarely the case. Especially if both parents have to work and are borderline alive whenever they come back.
Following all that, because that's not enough even when pursued assiduously for total demoralization, is the inculcation of an extremely damaging ideology, which essentially consists of 3 accusations.
Yeah, I understand that you feel very strongly about all of this, but what you're bringing up is almost purely opinion, and you're vague even at that. While that is understandable given the type of the video, it is a calling out of religious entities who in big part already agree with your worldview and thus need no qualifiers or evidence. It is on the other side not very persuasive to people who are outside of your particular bubble, because we not only lack the evidence of your very strong claims, which, I get it. For some it might be known and others might agree and not really care about the evidence, so why would you include it? But for anyone outside your bubble, those things would be very helpful in order to understand your view and maybe or maybe not agree with them. We also have no real reference points or context of what exactly you're talking about, and thus we can't really follow you or even understand your reaction. You're basically talking sanitized gibberish in the eyes of any outsider. As of this moment, based on your video, all we can do is acknowledge that this is how you feel and move on, trying to see maybe if what you offer later on does actually warrant such wording, or if it is far more personal to you and not representative of the actual truth.
Number 1, human culture, particularly in the West, is best construed as an oppressive patriarchy, motivated by the desire, willingness, and ability to use power, defined as the compulsion of others against their will, to attain what are purely selfish and self-serving ends. This is true at every level of analysis. Marriage is akin to slavery, friendship to exploitation, political disagreement to war, and business arrangements to deception and theft.
I'm well aware that there are people out there who think this way, and to my dismay I have interacted with some of them more than I would like to, but I can't say that I have met any of them who I wouldn't consider brainwashed cultists, or mentally sane for that matter. If anything, the problem of today is that society likes putting people with creepy ideas in the spotlight and glorifying them, rather than pointing out that what they're saying is utter nonsense. However, if we stretch the spectrum a bit, then there are of course people who to some degree espouse part of these ideologies for logical reasons. And in order to understand if they have a point, or to what degree they might or might not have a point, the only way to actually tell is to look at the system in place and determine if what they say is right or not, if it is a problem or not, and why.
Human culture, particularly in the West, is best construed as an oppressive patriarchy, motivated by the desire, willingness, and ability to use power.
I have to be honest and say that the word patriarchy here flies right past me. Having predominantly men in charge in a society is not really a problem, provided that the reason they are in charge is personal ambition, sense of responsibility, and hard work. Not nepotism, first quotas, or other shady business that we have in society for many groups and many other reasons. Or to put it differently, having a man in charge of your family is not a problem if the man is responsible, takes suggestions of other members into consideration, and puts priority on the well-being of his family. It turns into a problem if the man in charge is an abusive, selfish junkie who lets his family rot. And the same is also true for an entire system. And the same would also be true for a matriarchy with an abusive set of matriarchs. The problem there is not the system, the problem is the abuse thereof, and the people who are in charge. So when we look at Peterson's description of the perspective, oppressive patriarchy motivated by the willingness and ability to use power, then clearly the patriarchy part is not the main issue. It might as well be replaced with system, and it would be just as informative. Systemic systems of oppressive oppressions, as AIU used to call it. No, the key points instead are oppressive and motivated by the willingness and ability to use power. And even that doesn't really hit me the way it's probably meant to hit me. We do have an awful lot of people, entities and ideologies that are pushing to gain power. But our current system is not some class-based wannabe feudal system where you can't become a knight if you are a woman or a peasant. Or some kind of dictatorial theocracy where you're not allowed to learn how to read if it says so in the mighty holy book that someone made up centuries ago while being high on desert distils. We have in the West a lot, and I mean a lot, of female politicians, CEOs, and other members of shady professions. We are not in a state of oppression. I mean, if people holding this view would come to me and say that the sniffles restriction and prick mandates seemed rather intrusive and oppressive, then I would grant them that they have a point. However, those are neither patriarchy specific, nor are they considered oppressive by most of the people who hold that particular view. And so I wouldn't really make them count in this discussion right now. And there is no doubt that regardless of what system we are in, or would be in other circumstances, there will always be people eager to abuse a system or people within that system for personal benefit. It seems to me that the actual bias and abuse is a matter of massive wealthy corporations in alliance with bribable politicians, and not a matter of what body bits you may or may not have between your legs. However, there is something worth pointing out concerning that accusation, Petey. You said this.
Marriage is akin to slavery, friendship to exploitation, political disagreement to war, and business arrangements to deception and theft.
And this worldview specifically is one of low trust, low community, and high conflict. Successful marriage requires people to work as a team, take care of each other, and develop together. If two self-centered petty people marry, the relationship will not last and likely end very unpleasantly because they are self-centered petty people. Friendship requires trust and ability to bond too, because a well-developed friendship means that you're able to rely on your friends and are available to your friends in case they need you. Even business arrangements in a high-trust society are often started off with thinking about the benefit of both parties, ensuring that both get something out of the deal because both rely on the good reputation that the other one will spread within the community. Whereas in a low-trust society, no one cares about anyone's opinion. No one is considered a human, everyone is an asset, and everyone tries to get the best deal for himself out of a transaction without caring about the other. And the way to fix that is to create community. You know, bonds with neighbors, mates, quality high-trust relationships that make people have investments into their fellow humans. The way not to fix that is to go back to the wife shall submit to her husband or thou shalt have one only God or other such nonsense. Because that's merely dogmatic coating on top of the problem. It's basically like putting a band-aid on a festering wound. It doesn't help.
And this is true not only of the current social arrangements that characterize our culture, particularly in the West, but also the fundamental reality of history itself.
Oh yes, revisionism is very real. And it's a problem. We tend to see history, all of history, through a lens, and never as it actually was. That is true for the recent events and the more remote events just as much. Every historian and teacher, or generally every person talking about history, warps it when talking about it. And every source used, whenever it is written down, is equally warped by the perspective of whoever wrote it. Most of the Nazis didn't think that the Nazis were bad. Some, in fact, were happy that their country was no longer the massive inflation madness that it was before the regime change. And that would have been the spin that we would have read in our history books if history would have developed differently. The reason we don't is because they lost the war, and the winner, as usually, gets to choose the spin. The problem is not so much that people twist history, but that certain twists are at best unhelpful and at worst straight out damaging. For example, one can look at the founding fathers of the US and their efforts to have a country that is based on the people for the people. Or one can completely ignore that achievement and point out that they used to own people. And while one obviously is inherently more constructive and helpful than the other, both are spins and neither spin tells the complete truth. And we have to be mindful about this. One can cherish the brilliant art of Michelangelo and his very precise drawings and paintings of human bodies, or one can point out that in order to get his talent, he kept dissecting human corpses. One can cherish the findings of Galileo and his achievement in science, or focus on the fact that he impregnated a woman without marrying her, which at that time was pretty harsh, getting her and her children into huge trouble, and then sent his 2 daughters into an impoverished cloister, to which he had to eventually send food to not have them starve to death. Depending on what purpose and perspective a person has, that perspective is mirrored in the recounting of the history. Funnily enough, that doesn't only apply to history, but pretty much to everything we hear, see, or read. Even in scientific papers or scientific journals, you can spot the bias of the researchers sometimes. Even in fields that are supposed to reduce, if not eliminate such biases, you will find biases. And because of that problem, we can't take any claim at face value, regardless of who utters it. Because unfortunately, humans are not perfect. And even if they were, they would still have to have their information from somewhere, and that source itself could be biased. Luckily, we have at least a bit of a filter to deal with this problem. Whenever we encounter a claim of history, our first response should be, is it accurate? Can it be corroborated? What is the take or perspective of the narrator? And what would this part of history look like if I were to hear it from a person who holds the opposite perspective? In other words, what of what I hear or read is fact, what is flavoring, and what has not been said, what has been left out. And if we are mindful of this, we will be far, far less prone to this sort of skewed history, regardless if it's meant to motivate or depress us. Unfortunately, the people you are pleading to for help have a track record of not teaching you that sort of strategy. To the contrary, they tend to be a little more on the side of listen and believe.
Accusation number 2. Human activity, particularly that undertaken in the West, is fundamentally a planet-despoiling enterprise. The human race is a threat to the ecological utopia that existed before us and that could hypothetically exist in our absence. We might well be construed even as a cancer that threatens the very viability of the complex systems that make up the ecosystem of the Earth that shelters and supports us.
Oh yeah, there certainly are some nutcases out there in this world. Some of them believe that stuff too. However, the average environmentally concerned person is not of the "let's rid the planet of humanity" type. A lot of people also don't necessarily realize that their well-meaning attempts at climate protection, for example by buying an electric car, can actually contribute to a lot of damaging side effects either. In this particular incident, the poisoning of local communities and mass exploitation of children in Congo, which is one of the places where most of the cobalt that is needed to build the rechargeable batteries in our cars is predominantly dug up. And it's also mostly owned by China, which has an absolutely amazing track record of human rights, doesn't it? And there are countless instances where people will rail day and night about plastic straws, not realizing that they're giving a pass to everything else. The packaging of their food, the price stickers, the single-use pens and cartridges, the cooking utensils, the plastified paper cups, the non-stick pens, the lighters, the garbage bags, the sunscreen, the makeup, and the chargers and cables and food cans and inliners and. Or how about solar panels? They are made of polymers too. All of that stuff is needlessly wasteful and made with harmful petrochemicals and should be avoided. However, all of it gets overlooked by the vast majority of people, except the straws. Why the straws? Well, it's because those are talked about in the media. It is very frustrating, I give you that. However, I'm sorry to break it to you, Monsignor Peterson, but the average eco kinds of people aren't out to kill you. They don't really want to harm kids in Africa, they don't really want to rid the world of humanity, and they're often well-meaning, frequently uninformed, and in many cases just flat out stop it.
We are facing a Malthusian catastrophe of overpopulation and biosphere degradation. And we have to place extreme limits on our wants, even our needs, so that survival itself, even in a much reduced form, can be guaranteed.
No. Just no. We are not facing a Malthusian catastrophe. In the 60s, they had this big worry of overpopulation and mass starvation. But then we came up with all kinds of fertilizers and all sorts of tricks, and now we are producing way too much food in some areas. So much so that this microscopic spit of land in the world that is called Netherlands is the second biggest exporter of food in the whole world. That is actually very harmful considering how many chemicals are used for it, and it would be better to spread it out more. However, there's an awful lot of problems for people growing their own food nowadays. In fact, there are so many regulations that it is nearly impossible for small family farmers who would otherwise grow their food organically to actually make ends meet in a normal way. That is far, far more of a problem than the population itself. On top of that, we didn't get so much more people due to having more and more kids, but rather we had so many people because so many of the kids who were born did not die in childbirth or in the few years after. And as the world slowly balances out again, because after you notice that 8 of your 10 kids don't die from all kinds of diseases as they used to do, you maybe start to just get 2 instead of 10. And so the tides are turning. On top of that, we have a worldwide stagnation and even a decrease in population upon us. And that will hit within the next few decades. Let me show you what I mean. This is the National Institute of Demographics of France, or as they would call it, Institut National d'Études Démographiques. That sounds horrible. It's like speaking castrated Latin without any consonants. Guys, get back to your roots finally. What are you doing? This is not good for you. Either way, it's not perfect. It's a prediction model and not actual data. I mean, it's based on data, but it's still just a prediction model. However, it does show where the trend is going. It is, of course, not able to foresee the future and include many things that might or might not happen. For example, wars or sicknesses or that kind of stuff. But it is a decent-ish enough model to showcase what I mean, at least in broader strokes. So let us start with the most massive countries that we have, India and China. As you see, both have a shrinking demographic forecast once they hit the 22nd century. In China's case, it is shrinking by half of its current population. See this here? Absolute collapse. I mean, technically. China had a one-child policy since the 1970s. Then loosened it very recently to 2 children in 2015, and in 2021 they allowed 3, or in some places as many as people want. However, the birth rate still remains low, and it hasn't really improved whatsoever. Which, why would it? You have at best half as many people in childbearing age as you had the generation prior, and a quarter compared to the generation before that. And that half is skewed towards men, meaning you have technically even less. So even if all stops were completely removed now, you would need to have people to decide to have about 4 kids to compensate. And considering the huge discrepancy of old people compared to working age people, I would assume that 1 child alone already isn't all that cheap. I mean, either you personally have to work to sustain your 2 parents and potentially your 4 grandparents, or your taxes would have to do the heavy lifting, and you would still end up paying enormous amounts of money because you're the one who is paying the taxes. And so, if you were to add 4 children to the mix, that likely wouldn't be realistic whatsoever for anyone to bear, at least not for most of people. So China is about to lose a huge amount of the population at once, as soon as the generation prior to the one-child policy slowly dies of old age, and that is unless they start mass importing outsiders or force their population to reproduce like rabbits, which in turn would reduce their workforce and would have to be compensated for too, one way or another. That is a huge chunk of the worldwide population right there, out of the window. Now, if we look over to North America, you can see that it has a slight increase in population. However, the increase in those countries is, by my calculation, definitely not the birth rate, but instead immigration. In Canada, for example, we are at a point where a quarter of the entire workforce already has been taken over by immigrants, showcasing just how massive this subsection of the population actually is. Cut out that percentage, or even half of it, from the projection, and you will see how much in decline Canada actually is, population-wise. I wasn't exactly sure where to get the appropriate data for the US, but considering that Canada is far more picky about immigrants than the US is, on average, and that the US have a growing demographic shift towards Latin Americans, I doubt that the US case of an increase in population is all that different than Canada's. I would suspect that they too need their immigration in order to make up for their numbers. Europe overall shows a big decrease too, and that is in spite of the massive immigration in recent years. So for them, not even the people coming in can make up for the huge decrease in births. Which leads me to the main reason as to why we have that decrease, the birth rates, as I mentioned before. If we go back to India, we can see a huge spike and then a decrease. That is not a fluke or some wacky data. That is because the increase is not a de facto increase in people. It is a lack of decrease. Modern medicine allows people to live longer, especially in developing countries, which means that with the same birth rate, the death rate is delayed and decreased for a certain amount of time. However, we often don't have the same birth rate because the more infant mortality is stifled, the less children families tend to get overall. In other words, we cannot see the decrease in fertility on our general population scale until those babies hit old age, at which point you will have a sudden decrease. The only places that face population increase are predominantly poorer countries, as for example in Africa. However, if we look at the birth rate, we will see that even in Africa, where they're still growing in population, they have a decrease in births, meaning that over time, even they will either slow down the growth, level out, or have a decrease. Oh, by the way, if I forget to put the links of the sites in the description, leave me a comment to remind me, because that happened already twice, because I didn't remember, and I always get too excited about the fact that I can finally get a video done, and I always forget these things. You have to remind me, okay?
Accusation number 3. The prime contributor both to the tyranny that makes up the oppressive patriarchy and structures all of our social interactions, past and present, and the unforgivable despoiling of our beloved Mother Earth is damnable male ambition, competitive and dominating, power-mad, selfish, exploitative, raping and pillaging.
Another claim that is well known to me, and again, a claim that seems to come from people who are missing a bunch of screws, or alternatively are so well educated that they have learned the secret technique of not using the screws they technically possess. It is true that pillaging and raping is usually more attributed to young men and not old grannies, as is assaults, murder, aggression, and many other instances of direct physical violence. But the generalization does not paint the whole picture, does it? Because saying that young men, meaning young humans whose frontal lobe in many cases has not yet fully matured, and humans who have an increased bias for action due to the increased amount of testosterone in their blood, are predominantly the group doing certain actions, implies that having their attributes makes a person more prone to act in a certain manner. It does not imply, however, that the majority of people with these characteristics actually act that way. And it also doesn't mean that they have a monopoly on it. Not every woman is a disguised lawsuit that will metaphorically bite off your head like a praying mantis. Not every Muslim likes explosive dates, not every Viking wants to conquer Wakanda, and not every dog will decide to poop on your brand new white carpet. Although that last one would be totally justified. That abomination of a proto-bleached foot menace that you put into your room is a crime to humanity. Also, that is not even a fair comparison, Because these sorts of accusations aren't even just generalizations. They're theoretical concepts that got copy-pasted onto the real world without any nuance or context, or a semblance of reality for that matter, and then amplified and weaponized to accuse a huge chunk of the population of the proverbial original sin. Now, having said all that, I'd like to offer a hypothesis, one I've touched on in part 1. It's a bit off topic, but it fits surprisingly well. What if the main problem of these particular cases is not so much the hostility and the outrageousness of the accusations thrown at young men, but the readiness of these young men and of society to accept these accusations? Couldn't society debunk them, declare them bonkers and move on? Could the people possibly be primed to accept this sort of nonsense and feel guilty without really questioning it? I don't know, something along the lines of, how did it go again? Confiteor Deo omnipotenti, et vobis, fratres, quia peccavi nimis, cogitazione, verbo, opere, et omissione. Mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. I confess to thee, Almighty God, and to you, my brethren, that I have gravely sinned in thoughts, words, deeds, and omissions. Through my most grievous fault. I don't know about you, but if I would have been raised with that sort of mindset, I'd probably buy into that sort of hostile dogma quite easily. Just an idea, just throwing it out there.
You might think that I'm overstating the case.
No, I think you present the case the way you personally experience it. Whether that experience matches reality is a different story. Unless you believe that everyone's feelings are their own reality, in which case Peterson's reality is totally real, end of story, and you can't question it because he's stunning and brave and the video is over. Well, I guess I have to do a part 3 because I'm running out of voice. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you all for watching and have a wonderful evening.